You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Divine Simplicity, Part 2. Still not so simple, but here we go. PolyPat is back. Pat,
again.
How's it going, man? You had
Good.
a big week.
Yeah, a little tired. We're just getting back from Steubenville, Ohio, because I was on Matt Fradd's lovely show, Pints with Aquinas. So we drove the whole family out. So it was a nice 9-hour car ride to and from. But we made it. Thanks be to God. Safe trip. Good trip. Really enjoyed ourselves. So just recuperating from that. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. I mean, that's a big deal to be on his show. I mean, he reaches a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe it'd be a big deal for him to come on your show, actually, now that I think about it. But
Been on my show, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, though. And this is your second time being on Pints with Aquinas. And it seems like Matt is a really genuine guy, really good guy in person. I've never met him personally, but from your interactions, he seems like a pretty good friend.
Yeah,
even.
really gracious dude. Like you said, I was on a show before, but I Skyped in because of the whole, I think it was probably right around the initial Corona scare. And I was just talking about my conversion story. And then he wanted to have me on again, this time in his new studio, which is just gorgeous. It's beautiful. His setup, like the video quality, is it makes me feel really bad about my production setup, to say the least. And we were going to kind of focus on divine simplicity, but it ended up just kind of being more of this. We did talk about that. So we got into that, and it was good. But it just ended up just being a much more free-flowing conversation. It was really, really enjoyable, and just very organic. And Matt's, like you said, he really is a super gracious guy. Got to hang out with him a little bit at his new house in Steubenville beforehand, and just a joy to be on the show. Very grateful for the opportunity. So I hope people enjoyed the conversation. I had a lot of fun doing it.
That's great. Yeah, and that's why we're doing like a part 2 this week of Divine Simplicity, not only because it is a complicated topic and we could like spend the rest of our lives probably delving into it and still just be scratching the surface. And then secondly is you did have this opportunity to go on Matt Fradd's show. So I just wanted to unpack with you what you talked about. I've only listened to portions of it so far, and what I have listened to has been really good. But let's dig into that, as
Sure.
far as divine simplicity. You said you touched on it a little bit in your interview with him. What were some of the questions that were asked, or what were some of the points that were made?
Yeah, well, one thing got brought up that seemed to really resonate with Matt and some other people who I've heard feedback from, and I think it's a good general point where I know certain people, mostly Protestants, who are sort of resistant to becoming Catholic because they reject or they don't find plausible divine simplicity. And what I said to Matt is, one, I think this is a mistake because I think divine simplicity is true, but let's draw a parallel, right? There's some parallels here that I think might show a way out of this confusion. And the example I gave is one of a Christian talking to a Muslim, and imagine that you're talking to a Muslim, and the Muslim says, I'm attracted to Christianity. A lot of it makes sense to me, but I can't wrap my head around the Trinity. I think it's incoherent, right? So since I can't do that, I'm just not going to become Christian. Probably the Protestant would say something like, look, the Trinity it's very difficult. It's a mystery. And, I'll admit, maybe I don't even understand it myself either. However, we should focus on the resurrection, right? Because if Christ really did walk out of his tomb, then whatever other issues you have with Christianity, probably we can work through those, or at least we can accept those as a mystery, as long as we can show that they aren't just incoherent, right? And I think we can do that with the Trinity. So the point is that there's something that presents itself as more important, that's more clear, that you would want to focus on. I would want to say the same thing about the Catholic Church, right? Is divine simplicity is very difficult. I think that we can defend it. I think we can argue for it. I think we can deflect objections against it. But if you're resistant to becoming Catholic because you can't wrap your mind around divine simplicity, I'd want to draw the parallel to the example that I just gave and say, well, hold on, if we already have Christ, let's ask the more important question, the question that seems more obvious is, did Christ leave us with an authoritative church? Because if so, then it seems like we should become a part of that church. We should trust that church, even on teachings that are very difficult that we can't quite wrap our heads around. And Matt seemed to like that a lot. And that seems right to me, because divine simplicity is a very difficult thing. And I think we should always start with what seems to present itself as more important and is certainly more clear, and use that as our guide, rather than just, starting and like evaluating something that is super technical and then rejecting all of Catholicism or even all of Christianity outright because we can't fully comprehend it. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but that was something that got brought up in our conversation that I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think something that's attractive about divine simplicity is not only has it been a long held and established belief of the Catholic Church, but also like even the pagan philosophers, just by thinking about what God would be like, or like the underlying foundation of the universe, like they had to come to this just through their rational thinking, like Aristotle and others, right? I mean, we see all these thinkers that are like even outside of Christianity saying like, hey, this has to be the case, like just metaphysically.
Yeah. And it's not just pagans, but it's Hindus, Jewish, Muslim, right? You have thinkers from all different traditions converging upon this general theme of whatever else ultimate reality is, it's going to have to transcend or escape those categories that stand in need of an explanation. This came up in the conversation with Matt as well, is like, we have to understand what's motivating divine simplicity. And am I repeating myself? I honestly don't remember what we talked about.
No, keep going. This is great.
Because I've had like the conversations of divine simplicity. I've had like 4 or 5 of them in the past week. So like it's all mixed in my head of what I've said and what I haven't said before.
Let it come out.
So I'll just, if I'm repeating myself, well, then there you go. But what I said to Matt is, what motivates it is we discover these features of reality that stand in need of an external explanation. And one of them is compositeness, right? That composite things require a cause. And we can look at this physically, whether a chair, right? How did a chair get together? Well, somebody put it together, but it also like there's other things operative, external to the chair, that need to be in place in order for the chair to stay together, right? Like we have friction forces, electromagnetism, all that stuff, right? So it's not just that composite things require a cause to come into being. They also need a concurrent cause to explain, well, why do they have this particular composite arrangement rather than not, right? So you can think of it physically, or you can think of it metaphysically, such as the real distinction between essence and existence, where if there's a contingent thing that exists not in virtue of what it is, but in virtue of something else, well, how did these come together, right? It couldn't have been that the essence imparted existence to itself. That makes no sense, because it doesn't exist until existence is imparted to it. And the idea of self-causation is radically incoherent, right? Because then it would have to pre-exist itself to cause itself. But if it pre-existed itself, then it wouldn't need to cause itself, because it would already exist, right? So the idea with compositeness is, in order to escape an explanatory vicious circle, we have to get beyond the category of compositeness altogether, not just physically, but especially metaphysically, right? And in order to do that, we're going to have to move from composite being to simple being, right? And on the metaphysical level, something where there is no distance or difference or distinction between its essence and existence, what it is and the fact that it is, which is why, people often poetically say that God just is to be. And this is something, of course, that is, as you pointed out, this is to your point, Eric, is like, this isn't just like a something that is specific to the Christian religion. This is something that metaphysicians have realized in various different traditions, that certain aspects of reality cry out for an external explanation. And if we believe that reality is fully intelligible, that things can make sense, that explanations can be cashed out, right? If we drive the principle of sufficient reason through, in order to cash out ultimate explanations, we're going to have to park in that which is absolutely simple, purely actual, whose essence just is existence. Yes. So I said to Matt, like, if you're coming at it as a metaphysician, it's divine simplicity or bust for me, right? Because this is the only way that we're going to be able to say reality really is completely intelligible. It does make sense. We can terminate these explanatory hunts. And I think that that's a really important point to make, because It's overlooked. Like what motivates this? Sometimes people just look at the conclusion. They think that seems strange. That seems spooky. And that would be missing, I think, what is the most fundamental aspect of the classical theistic project is that divine simplicity is what terminates the hunt for ultimate intelligibility, right? It's the metaphysical causal reasoning that motivates that. And if you're going to deny that, there's going to be a big cost with that denial. And I think that big cost is going to concede more than any theist will ultimately want to bear.
And actually, that's where I wanted to go with this is, for the Protestants or whoever that balks at divine simplicity for whatever reason, they're like, oh, I can't believe that, or if I have to believe that to become Catholic, then I just won't become Catholic. Like you mentioned before, like some people maybe say that. How would you describe to them? Like, okay, if you reject divine simplicity, here's what's at stake. Like, here's what you're losing.
Yeah.
In fact, basically you're undercutting your own legs in your Christian beliefs if you reject divine simplicity.
Yes. Yeah.
And so explain that to us. Like, why is that the case? Like, what is so bad about rejecting divine simplicity?
Yeah. Let me say a couple things in response to this. First is, many Protestants affirm divine simplicity, right?
Yes.
So it's not just like a Catholic Protestant thing. I mean, there's great Protestant thinkers who are classical theists, right? A friend of mine, Stephen Nemish, he's a Protestant. He has published work defending divine simplicity. There's James Dolezal, who's got a great book, God Without Parts, who defends divine simplicity. Norm Geisler, famously critical of the Catholic Church, but a rigorous defender of divine simplicity, right? And it's because they realize what we've been talking about, right? It's right. So I just want to make it clear. This isn't just like a clear-cut Catholic Protestant divide thing, right?
Exactly.
Even though a lot of people criticizing divine simplicity, they are Protestant, right? So let me just a mark of clarification there. Okay, there's a reason that thinkers, another non-Catholic thinker, David Bentley Hart, a defender of divine simplicity, says things like to deny divine simplicity is to embrace atheism.
Wow.
Now that's rhetorical, but there's deep truth in that. Now, why is that? Well, if you deny divine simplicity, and what I said is true, is correct, then you've kind of arrived at some type of brute stopping point, right? And we've arrived at a point where we can always ask, well, why stop there rather than somewhere else? So I brought this up on Matt Fradd's podcast, and I think what a number of Protestants are doing is they're starting from not a general metaphysical project where they're trying to carve reality at its joints and find ultimate explanations. They're rather starting from Scripture, and instead of looking for an ultimate explanation, they're looking for an ultimate person, right? That they see God as a person. Well, we're persons. Let's start stripping away things that we don't think apply to God, like God doesn't have a body and God has, he's omniscient, which maybe means something like knowing only an all true proposition. So they get to something that escapes some limitations that we have, but never fully transcends or seems to fully transcends all those categories that stand in need of an explanation. So they still will allow, many of them, certain aspects of composition in God, for example, that would seem to be somewhat arbitrary. And so I think they really do open themselves up to the common cliches or the critiques of, well, who caused God? What explains God? And I think if you want to avoid these things, it's divine simplicity or bust. So that's one thing. Another thing is that divine simplicity, let me spend another minute on that, right? As soon as you open yourself up to that, to the sort of brute factness, if you don't come to a principled, full metaphysical explanation, the atheist will say, well, look, you've kind of got bruteness in your explanation.
Out of the gaps or whatever.
Yeah, well, you've got bruteness here. Like, you kind of stop at these limits. Sure, it's like a little bit bigger than mine, but if you've got arbitrary stopping points, well, then why can't I have arbitrary stopping points? I'll just say that the universe is all we need, right? And then you kind of get in this like, sort of abductive battle, right? Where the theist will then have to start to say, well, I think my explanation still explains more of the data than yours, but you never get the full metaphysical demonstration that you get as classical theists do, and the full richness of complete intelligibility the classical theists do. So it's certainly, at the very least, if it doesn't completely concede atheism, maybe I wouldn't go as far as David Bentley Hart, it significantly weakens the case for theism, right? And then it's just kind of like comparing one model to another model of like which we think better captures the data, right?
Yeah.
Rather than providing a fully robust metaphysical explanation of why God must exist, right? And that's
what are some compartmentalizations or compositions, I should say, that they often put forward as like, well, God is composed of this and this. Like, what are some of those things that you can think of that they would say, yeah, like he's not simple because he has this and then he has this? And
yeah, it's gonna depend on the thinker, but certainly a number of them would deny divine immutability, right? So they'll put potency in God. That's the quick answer of it. They'll have certain potencies in God. So they'll make God a composite of act and potency, which we would argue is metaphysically absurd, right? For various reasons, because potency is going to depend on any composite being, as we were talking about before, is going to depend on some type of extrinsic explanation, right? And there can't be any potency in God simply by the fact that if we're hunting down. Now, I should also say that go ahead, Eric. You wanted
to clarify potency, it's the potential to act, like it's
something that could be brought about, right? Something that is it's sort of I wonder if it's even worth just kind of like going through, or maybe we should do a separate episode on it, on just like where these distinctions come from, right? Like where the act potency distinction comes from, because a lot of people who put potency in God, I don't think they realize what they're doing because they haven't been doing metaphysics, right? Right? They haven't wrestled with, say, the problem of change. Like, what is the problem of change, right? How do we make sense of change? This is the perennial philosophical problem. And there were philosophers who would deny the reality of change because they thought that it involved something coming from nothing, right? That the coffee is cold, but then it becomes hot. How do we explain that? It doesn't seem like there was hotness in the coffee before, but now it's hot, so it seems like something came from nothing, and that's absurd, right? That's surely, if anything is absurd, it's something coming from nothing, right? So you had thinkers like Parmenides and these sort of pre-Socratic, Eleatic philosophers who would argue this. And then you would have thinkers like Aristotle who would say, well, that seems really fishy, right? Because Parmenides would say that we should deny change, right? That just change isn't a real feature of the world at all. And surely, like, change has got to be real. Do you mind if we take a few minutes to build this up? Because I think it'll be helpful, right? Surely change has to be a real feature of the world. Because, like, to even be convinced by Parmenides' argument that change isn't real, I would have to change my mind, right? I'd have to work through the steps of his argument and arrive at his conclusion. Like, so it's a reductio, right? It just cannot possibly be true. So we have to try and make sense of change. How do we make sense of it? Change can't be something coming from nothing. And this is where Aristotle comes in. He says it isn't something coming from nothing. Change involves the actualization of a potency, of a sort of middle level of being, right? So we have actual being, we have non-being, we also have potencies, which are these sort of dormant capacities within actual realities themselves that can be brought about, that can be actualized, right? So within my coffee, it is cold, but it's potentially hot. It really has the potential to become hot, and it can become hot if something actualizes that potency inherent to this substance, right? And what could do that? Well, I could put it in a microwave, I could heat it up on the stove, etc. So potencies are grounded in actualities, right? They're not nothing, but in order to bring a potency about, you need something already actual that has the power to bring it about, right? So this is kind of the background metaphysics, right? And now this will apply on the order of existence as such, where Aquinas will eventually come along and say anything that has a real distinction between its essence and existence, those two things stand in relation as potency to act, right? That the essence, say my essence, right, until existence is imparted to it, is just a potency, right? It doesn't exist. It's a possibility, but in order to be made actual, you need something that can really bring it about, that can impart existence to it, and that's going to be God, right? Ultimately. So once you understand that, once you understand this relationship between potency and act, between essence and existence, once you get to God as pure existence itself, like there's no potency left, right? It's pure actuality, pure existence, pure being. It's all the side of actuality, no side of potency. So we escape composition altogether. And then if you want to try and put a potency in God, what are you going to say? That there's some potency in God? Well, what's going to actualize that? Well, you're going to need something more fundamental, deeper to actualize it. So whatever that potency is, that wouldn't be God, right? That would just be some effect, some caused reality that God brought about. It would be distinct from God. Another way to see this, and let me just give a sketch of an argument I gave on Matt real quick, because I think this will clarify why God can't be composed of potency and act. All right. First thing we'll say, in all of reality, there has to be at least one uncaused or unconditioned reality. Why is that? Think of it like this. If everything in reality were caused, if everything in reality were conditioned, as in it stands in a dependency relation on certain things beyond itself, right? So take me, for example. I exist as a conditioned reality because there's certain conditions external to me that have been fulfilled. Yes, I have a mom. Yes, I have a dad. But even more fundamentally than that, I depend on cellular structure, molecular bonding, electromagnetic fields, right? An atmosphere. If you start tweaking or deleting these conditions, goodbye, Pat Flynn, right? You would have not just prevented me from coming into existence, you would snuff me out of existence, right? So I don't exist in virtue of what I am. I derive existence from the fulfillment of various sort of cobweb of conditions, right? Mm-hmm. That not only brought me into existence, but keeps me into existence. Could everything be like that? Could everything even just collectively be a conditioned reality? And the answer is emphatically no, because if everything, just think of a big blob, the totality of everything that's real, right? And this is just by definition, if it's real, it's in the blob. Could everything be a conditioned reality, even collectively, in as much as it stands in a dependency relation to something external to itself? And the answer here is emphatically and obviously no, because beyond this blob of everything, there's nothing. So nothing could fulfill the conditions necessary to bring a condition, this collectively conditioned reality about. And this gives us a conclusion that if we say that everything needs a cause, that everything is a conditioned reality, then nothing would exist. Full stop, which is a contradiction of fact. So another way to think about it is, could there be a cause outside of everything? No. Because outside of everything is nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And this invites a very interesting paradox. And that paradox is that most things seem conditioned, most things seem caused, but we can know that not everything can be, right? Not everything can be. There must be at least one uncaused, unconditioned reality in the totality of everything real. Okay, now we can ask, what the heck is that thing, right? Like, what is that? That's got to be like a strange, interesting thing, now, right?
Real quick, Pat, going back to that, what if someone would say, like, the blob itself basically there's different beings within the blob that cause each other. Like when you take all the connections within the blob itself, that it is self-existing, even though not one part of it is in itself uncaused, but everything causes each other.
I see what you're saying, right? So there's a couple ways that somebody might try and do this. One is just a circle of causes, right? Yeah. A causes B, B causes C, C causes A. There's a bunch of issues with that. One is that the nature of efficient causality is going to have certain properties to it that it's not going to – let me put that aside because that's going to probably be too that won't make any sense to this conversation. But let's think about it like this, right? Let's start with an easier example, and then we'll show how it won't work with the circle either. This is good. We want to clear this up, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with an infinite regress, because that's going to be the first one you're going to say. Now, if you'll notice the way I set the argument, it's neutral in whether the blob of everything contains a finite or infinite number of things. It's neutral to that. If it contains, and the short answer is that an infinite amount of zero is still zero, right? So if you have an infinite amount of conditioned realities, an infinite amount of realities that stand in a dependence relation upon something beyond itself in order to exist, it doesn't matter if it's finite or infinite. An infinite amount of zero is still zero, right? So Or think of it this way, right? If A depends upon B, and B depends upon C, and C depends upon D, depends upon, and you just want to string that out to infinity, well, what are you saying, right? What you're saying is that there's always one plus more condition we can go, right? Before that first thing, A, could ever be achieved, right? So A is here. We say we've achieved A. It's real. But now with the infinite regress, we're saying that it's actually unachievable, right? We're infinitely deferring, infinitely delaying, infinitely frustrating the ultimate fulfillment of conditions that could ever bring A about. So we actually get a contradiction from that because we've achieved something, but we set up a causal regress that sets up a fulfillment of conditions that is in principle unachievable. So we have achieved something that is in principle unachievable. That's a contradiction. Can't work. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right? Then just try and put it in a circle. You have the same issue, right? So just bend it around, put it in a circle. A depends upon B, depends upon C, and then it just goes around, right? So A causes B, B causes C, C causes A. Okay. Does a circle have a finite number of rotations, right? Let's ask that first. If it has a finite number of rotations, then we're going to get upon some final condition, right? And then we can ask, maybe we go around 10 times and we stop, right? We stop at C 10 times around. We can ask, does C have its conditions for existence fulfilled? If the answer is no, then C never came to exist, and then the whole circle falls out of existence. Do we see that, right?
Yeah.
If we just keep going infinitely, then we have the same problem that I just described before, and putting it in a circle doesn't solve the issue, right? Because we just have dependent upon. So it remains conditionally iffy, right? So this will exist only if this, only if this, only if this, only if, but we never get a categorical fact of the matter that it ever came to exist, right? So it's always conditional. It's never categorical unless you have something either within or beyond that circle that could have brought it into existence. Full stop. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yeah.
So the point I'm saying is, it doesn't matter how you try to, it doesn't matter how many things you put into reality. It doesn't matter how you try to arrange it in lines, in matrices, in cobwebs, in circles. The argument works no matter what. If there isn't at least one unconditioned reality, either within these causal, the sort of causal setup, either within it or beyond it, then it's always nothing, right? It's always going to be nothing no matter what.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. And that's a good one. I mean, that's one of the more kind of serious, if people want more detailed explanation on that, I go into those objections into my little ebook, How to Think About God, for this. Okay. So it's also important to note that a lot of atheists these days actually, they grant that, right? A lot of atheists these days are totally on board with there having to be at least one necessary reality, because they grant the force, the serious, like, philosopher of religion skeptics, right? Okay. So once we have that there has to be some reality that just exists through itself, we can ask, well, what is that? And then we're going to say it has to be, an active existing through itself. Okay. Now this is going to be critical to understanding why there can't be potency in God. All right. So we already know that this reality has to be uncaused. It has to be unconditioned. Now, why does it have to be an active existing through itself? Well, think of it this way. If it wasn't already actual, then it would have to be made actual, which means it would be conditioned. It would be caused. And that's a contradiction because we already says it has to be uncaused, right? And if it wasn't existing through itself, then it would have to be existing through another, which again means it would be conditioned on something beyond itself, right? Contradiction. So there's no way out of this, right? It has to be not just an active existing through itself. It has to be a pure act of existing through itself. Because is there anything about this reality, any feature, part, dimension that were different from the active existing through itself, then it wouldn't be actual or existing through itself, and it would be caused, right? It would be a caused reality. So there's no way to get a differentiating feature into God, right? Now, why is this critical? Well, it's critical for a couple of reasons. Now we see why there can't be potencies in God. All potency is going to be extrinsic to God. So anybody who puts a potency in God you haven't found the ultimate explanation of things. So hopefully this makes sense of what we said earlier now at this point. And it's so important, again, to see like how we get there, right? Because it's hard to just stay at the conclusion. You got to see what motivates it, right? So now we can see, okay, there can't be any potency in God, because then we would have a being that is composed, right? And now there's some part in God that would have to be actualized. We already just proved that God must be a pure act of existing through himself. So it makes no sense. It's contradictory, right? But also, because God isn't susceptible to differentiating features, this secures a robust monotheism, right? God can't be multiplied out. We can't have multiple instances of God, because to have multiple instances of something, we need some way to tell instant one apart from instance two, right? So one instance would have to lack something or be somewhere or not have some power that the other one had. And we already said that none of that's going to apply to God, right? So to deny divine simplicity and to open up God to composition in any sense really loses the security we have on a robust monotheism. Because while you might say, well, it just happens in fact that we have one God, you've lost the grounding to say, actually, no, we have one God in principle, not just in fact. And divine simplicity gives us that because God is pure actuality, because he's not susceptible to differentiating features, he's not susceptible to multiplication, right? And that's another big part of the stakes, right? So not only do you undermine the case for theism when you deny divine simplicity, but I would say you lose the security we have for a robust monotheism as well, and in principle monotheism. And those, like I said, those are bullets that I don't think any theist should want to bite, especially because divine simplicity is true, right? Is where the arguments lead, but there's heavy costs associated with it. So this conversation took an interesting turn. I dumped a lot on the table there, and I hope it answers the questions you
Well, let's just take it to one more level here, Pat.
Let's keep going. Does all that make sense? I hope that's clear.
Yes.
I think it's just so important. You brought up really good questions, but I had to try and go back to the starting point to show what motivates the responses. And that's I think that's important that we do that, because if we just stay in the conclusion and say, well, here's why there can't be any potency of God, but we haven't really talked about what motivates the act potency distinction to begin with and how that leads to God's existence, it's never going to convince anybody. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. How do we think about the Trinity in light of divine simplicity?
Yeah. Good one, right? This is a typical objection, and there's a couple things I want to say to it. Actually, there's a lot I want to say to it, but I'll have to be brief. The first thing I want to say is the Trinity doesn't really add an extra layer of difficulty to divine simplicity, right? And what I mean by that is whatever you want to say about the Trinity being difficult, it's hard to see what divine simplicity adds to that difficulty, right? Because every Christian wants to say that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Father is distinct from the Son, is distinct from the Holy Spirit, etc. Right? That's something we have to work through, right? And there's specific issues there, okay, we can't use the same type of identity that Leibniz's law would have us use, so we have to have some other type of our metaphysical toolkit has to be a little bit broader to talk about identity when it comes to the Trinity, right? And we can do that, and the scholastics have just those types of distinctions. And we're not putting any real composition in God with the Trinity, right? Because if we did, we'd enter a heresy of tritheism, right? No Christian wants tritheism.
Partialism, Patrick.
Right. Yeah. And yeah. Right. St. Patrick. Right. So what I'm saying is a lot of people throw out divine simplicity as an objection to Trinity, but it's not clear exactly you see what I'm saying? What's the difficulty here, or what's the additional difficulty? Right. So I'm asking the critic for clarification. Okay, you say well, what about divine simplicity and Trinity? I'm saying, well, what about it? What's the additional difficulty here that we don't already have with just the Trinity in general? You see what I'm saying? And that's rarely ever spelled out. So until that's spelled out, there's not a whole lot to do of saying, okay, well, whatever else divine simplicity is, it's not talking about the inner life of God. What divine simplicity is talking about is, here's all the categories we know from our experience that stand in need of an extrinsic relationship. And whatever those categories of composition are, that's not going to apply to God. But if there's some other type of distinction, say a relational distinction in God, which is what we hold in Trinity, that God has revealed to us about his inner life, which we do not have access to through the metaphysical project, fine, right? That's not an initial conflict, right? And what I also want to, but I would go even further and say this, that divine simplicity actually helps, I think, better ground the Trinity. I'm not saying that divine simplicity can get you to the Trinity, but once we have the Trinity, I think it makes better sense of it. And we can have rough psychological analogies to see why this is the case. Take our own consciousness, right? It's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable thing because it's a very simple thing. It's a simple reality in as much as it's transparent to itself, right? We're aware, but we're also aware of the fact that we're aware. So we can like double back upon ourselves. It's incredible, which seems like physically impossible. We'd have to be like moving faster than the speed of light. So the answer to that, if you're not a materialist, is that consciousness somehow transcends certain material physical restrictions, right? It's a simpler reality. It has less restrictions to it. And because it has less restrictions, it's more transparent to itself. It's self-appropriating, right? And then what we have is this very simple reality that has sort of relations of opposition, right? I'm aware of the fact that I am aware, right? So there's my awareness, and then there's the awareness of my awareness. And analogies, now realize we don't have a perfect analogy for the Trinity, right? But these are just rough analogs that can start to get us to see how something like this is not only possible, but compatible with divine simplicity, where God, as the highest intellect, it has the idea of himself, the Son, right? And there's a shared understanding and love between the Father and the Son, right? And it's through the simplicity and self-transparency and highest intellect of God that we can start to see how you can have an absolutely simple reality where somehow there's relational opposition, right? Without any of the distinct ontological categories that we have in the metaphysical project that stand in need of an external explanation. And what I'm arguing is that simplicity gives us a sort of the highest form of immateriality, which gives us the highest form of transparency, which seems to actually sit very well with this idea of relational opposition, where the relations are persons, amazingly, are persons, right? So, and then I think at some point we just have to say that this is a mystery that God has revealed to us, that we don't have any, seriously appropriate analog on the side of creation, but that's fine because there's no contradiction there. It seems to sit very well with divine simplicity. At the very least, we would say that divine simplicity doesn't add to the difficulties of the Trinity. And I would go even a little bit further and say it seems to actually provide a better sort of ontological grounding for the Trinity.
Yes.
If anything.
Because we would still affirm one essence in three persons, but one essence, and that essence has to be simple. It has to be essence that exists, or the essence that is existence that is his essence. And so it's still that simple essence of God that there's just one essence, one God in three persons. One
essence, one intellect, one will, but relations of opposition in God. That's the key, right? And that's really look, Bernard Lonergan is really great on this. I would point to him if people want to go deeper in that. Also, Father Thomas Joseph White has some really good stuff on the Trinity and simplicity if people want to go deeper. But the first thing is, okay, it's not enough just to like assert something. Well, what about the Trinity, right? Well, what about it, right? And divine simplicity, you have to spell the objection out. What is the additional difficulty of simplicity? Maybe there is one, but it needs to be spelled out. It's not because if you're just saying that we need composition in God, then you need to tell me how you avoid tritheism, and you're not a heretic as a Protestant, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like simplicity gives us a good answer to that. We also need to avoid modalism.
Yes.
Right? So those are like the two things we really need to avoid. And to me,
modalism, just for our listeners, is where like there is no real distinction between the persons. It's like the Father is the Son and is the Holy Spirit, and they just came to us in different phases,
different like expressions.
So it's like they're wearing
right?
masks, expressions. But we deny that is a heresy because no, they are distinct persons within the one Godhead.
Yeah, and it's just important that there's it's different, right? So what we do through metaphysics is we don't have any access to God's inner life metaphysically, right? Like, especially in the Thomistic tradition, Aquinas is like notorious from being like one click away from being an agnostic, right?
Yeah.
It's apophatic. This is what God is not. And it's analogical. God has something like, right? But we have no way of really comprehending the divine essence. And certainly we have no access to God's inner life. So then if God reveals something about his inner life, great, but we don't really have the philosophical tools to get there by ourselves, right? Which means that the evaluation is always going to be somewhat limited. We can show that, okay, it's not contradictory, it's not incoherent, but there's always going to be a sort of there's always going to be this mystery that we can never fully pass, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think where maybe people get hung up with the Trinity and divine simplicity would simply be probably just a misunderstanding of what we believe in as the Trinity. They may have a heretical view that they're working with, and that's why it seems incompatible. But when you actually have an orthodox view of the Trinity, there is no incompatibility with divine simplicity.
Right, like a tritheism. I think a lot of and like they won't admit this, but I think a number of people who pose that objection are just implicitly tritheists, and that's heretical, right?
Yeah, and that would be where there's three different gods.
Essentially, right, like three substances, and that's definitely not the case. Yeah,
one God, three persons.
Exactly. Right. So good stuff, man. This was
awesome.
Fun, difficult topic, but hopefully we've shown the motivation, the arguments. There's always more that could be said. What the stakes are, what the costs of denial are.
Yes.
And that it's something that even if we can't philosophically demonstrate the Trinity, which is what Aquinas holds, right? There are some philosophers who say that you can give some philosophical arguments for the Trinity. I'm not convinced by any of those. But certainly we can show that there isn't a contradiction or a deep incompatibility between the Trinity and divine simplicity. Mm-hmm.
I love it. I love that this shows truly the balance and the cooperation between faith and reason. Reason can get us to the fact that there is just one God and that he's simple. We can intellect our way to that. But we need him to reveal himself, the inner life of himself. And that's where faith comes in. Like he gives us revelation of himself. And that's how we know of the Trinity, that the Son was in the bosom of the Father from all eternity, and he came, as God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. He came and dwelt among us and revealed the Father to us, and then sent the Holy Spirit, and so then it's like, wow, this is beautiful. How faith and reason don't contradict each other. They build each other up. Reason leads to this building up of the faith, and the faith reinvigorates our reason. So
absolutely.
I love it, man. So thank you.
Brother. Good stuff.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. God bless.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.